Hello everybody and welcome to my YouTube channel. I of course am just another Heavy Metal Maniac, and right away you might have noticed that this is not my usual setup. Indeed it is not. I am currently visiting my sister's house just for a couple days. I will be back at my home tomorrow. Yeah, I just decided to make this video here because it's a kind of a thread that's been going around for like a few days and I didn't want to like jump on it too late, so I'm making this video right now. But one of the threads that's going around lately in the metal YouTube community is it's a thread that's actually been kind of like, I guess, revived in a way. Metal Mickey made a video discussing like the 20 albums on his road to death metal, just, talking about the albums that got him into death metal. Really cool video. But yeah, this is one older thread from, I believe, about 7 or 8 years ago that a lot of people made responses to back then, and it's been kind of revived and people are making, responses to it now. So, yeah, I thought I'd hop on this little thread and just throw in my 2 cents. So I've gathered a small list of 10 albums that got me into death metal. A lot of people, like, when they were making this, they, didn't just talk about death metal albums strictly. They also just talked about a lot of albums that kind of, like, laid the groundwork for them to get into death metal, which I think is, which I think makes sense. So I've gone with a bit of that. So I've gone with, like, 4 albums that I wouldn't necessarily classify as death metal, but they definitely helped laid the groundwork for me to get into death metal. And then the other 6 are albums that I would consider to be death metal albums, like definitely just albums that really cemented my love of death metal. So yeah, without further ado, enough of my ramblings, let's just get right into this video. One genre people have been bringing up a lot in this little thread response is thrash metal, which definitely, makes sense. I feel like that's a very natural evolution for a lot of people getting into metal that, or like a lot of people get into death metal, you first get into thrash metal, and you listen to bands like Slayer and, all the old school thrash bands, and then you gradually kind of get heavier and heavier and transition into death metal. So I've gone with a couple of thrash albums, because for me, when I got into thrash, because I'm obviously much younger than a lot of the other people that are making, responses to this, I got into like all the old school thrash bands like around the same time pretty much. So sometimes like individual albums don't really stand out to me in particular, but these 2 I feel like kind of do. I've gone with 2 thrash albums. And the first one I want to discuss is Tapping the Vein by Sodom. This is definitely the heaviest Sodom album, I think, without a doubt. Like, this is kind of a borderline death metal album in spots. This album came out at a very interesting time, in metal. This was 1992, so thrash metal was very much on its way out. Death metal was kind of taking its place as the new, king of the whole extreme metal. So I feel like Sodom kind of like were observing the landscape of metal at the time and were like, well, fuck it, let's just make the heaviest thing we possibly can, and good God, did they do just that. Yeah, this album, ever since I first heard it, this album has always really stuck out to me as just a very heavy album. Yeah, like this, like again, the production of this album, the guitar tone is just super thick and meaty. It's vicious. Tom Angel Ripper, this is probably one of Tom Angel Ripper's best vocal performances. Like, it's just absolutely ripping. And he just sounds like an absolute madman, and I love it. But yeah, this album, I feel like, looking back on it, this album definitely kind of helped, again, lay the groundwork for me to get into death metal, because this is definitely heavier than a lot of the other, like, old school thrash albums, which, don't get me wrong, I love all those albums, but this one is just heavier, and for that reason, it's always kind of really stuck out to me. This is, I mean, I assume most of you here have probably seen my Sodom ranking. This was number 2 on my list. I love this album, and yes, Tapping the Vein, one of the albums that I've definitely, I feel like, laid the groundwork for me to get into death metal, and yeah, I love this album, and again, it's just an insanely heavy thrash album, and I love it. Another old school thrash metal album I want to discuss for this video is none other than The Gathering from Testament. So again, much like Tapping the Vein, this is, to me, is just like a very heavy kind of thrash album that, like, when I listened to it, at first I really wasn't aware of what death metal was, but looking back on it, I feel like this album really kind of was able to help usher me into it, because I feel like this is maybe not their heaviest album, but like out of their kind of more, I guess, death metal leaning material, because like Testament definitely experimented with death metal in the 90s, like with Demonic, which I'm kind of iffy on that album personally. It's a really mixed bag in my opinion. But The Gathering, I absolutely love this album. Like, I mean, hell, this album is basically a supergroup. You have Steve DiGiorgio, Dave Lombardo, and James Murphy all on one album. Like, come on, dude, how can you not love that? But yeah, this album to me is just like a perfect blend of like kind of every kind of like different sound Testament experimented with. Hey, buddy. Uh, yeah, it's like, you know, a perfect blend of just like their old school thrash sound, but you also get hints of death metal and a little bit of groove metal, but it's just for the most part, it's just pretty, you know, blistering and fast. And yeah, I love it. It's an amazing album. And again, very heavy. The production on it, I believe, is Andy Sneap, and oh, Bowser wants to say hi. And yeah, the production is also pretty heavy. Filming a video, bud. Yeah, this album is, again, to me, it's very much in the same vein as Tapping the Vein by Sodom, did not, pun not intended, where, you know, it's just a very, very heavy thrash album, and definitely heavier than a lot of the other kind of thrash albums that I was listening to at the time, because I got into, like, all the old school thrash bands around the same time, but these two albums have always really stuck out to me in particular for just being very heavy, like, for thrash albums, and definitely, because I heard these albums before I ever heard anything like death metal, so yeah, that was very big for helping me, you know, get into death metal. So the next album I want to discuss for this video is one that's a little bit harder to classify genre-wise. Like, you could say this band is partially death metal. You could argue death metal is definitely part of their sound, but they're also kind of thrash, but also kind of groove metal, but they also have like a lot of industrial elements in their sound. And that band is none other than Strapping Young Lad, and I'm talking specifically about their second album, City. So Strapping Young Lad was the first band, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the first band started by Canadian prog metal eccentric guy, really one-of-a-kind musician, obviously, Devin Townsend. And yeah, this, for me, Strapping Young Lad was kind of a band I got into when I was really big into like kind of my whole like 90s metal thing, because I got into like I really got big into like a lot of the 90s bands. Like, I've always been a giant Pantera fan, Typo Negative, Biohazard, Vision of Disorder, stuff like that. But Strapping Young Lad is definitely like heavier than all those bands, I feel like especially on this album, because the debut, I think it's decent, but it's definitely very, very sloppy. The album is just pure fucking hostility and aggression. Like, 13, I was like probably 12 or 13 when I first heard this album. I hadn't heard anything that sounded like this at all. Like, I just was like, holy fuck, this is an insanely heavy album. The snare sounds like a fucking gunshot. It's insane. And Devin Townsend, you know, he's just barking his guts out and he's spitting just venom. And yeah, this album is just full bore, just constantly beating you down in your face. And again, this album is just pure aggression, hostility. Like, this is like one of the angriest albums ever made. Like, Devin Townsend was beyond pissed when he made this album. Like, yeah, I absolutely love this album, and this is definitely probably my favorite album from Strapping Young Lad, even though I love like Alien and almost as much, and the self-titled album too. Whatever, I love this band. Admittedly, I still need to dive into more Devin Townsend projects, but yeah, City, yeah, this is definitely an album that very much laid the groundwork for me to get into death metal. Again, you could argue death metal is definitely a part of their sound, although I definitely wouldn't classify them strictly as a death metal band, because again, there's like a lot of groove metal, a lot of thrash, a lot of kind of, again, and you get those industrial elements all kind of thrown in together as well. But yeah, I just love this album, and this is definitely one of the heaviest albums I ever heard when I was just, you know, still relatively new to metal, and this is definitely one of the albums that helped me get not into just like death metal specifically, but just more extreme metal and more heavy metal in general. The final album of the albums that aren't necessarily death metal, but helped me get into death metal that I want to discuss is kind of a newer album. I say newer, it came out in, I believe, 2008 if I remember correctly, so yeah, it's over 10 years old at this point. And that is none other than Meshuggah's Obscen. Now, Meshuggah, I know a lot of people don't like the term gent or don't like the genre gent. I'm personally not big on that term or that style either. Most gent bands I just really do not care for at all. But Meshuggah, to me, they are definitely the pioneers of the sound, and they've always been the best, and they will always probably forever continue to be the best. And yeah, this was the first Meshuggah album I ever heard. The song Bleed, I think everyone loves that song Bleed. How can you not? That's like one of the most insane metal songs ever written. But this whole album is really just insane. Again, songs like Combustion, Lethargica, Dancers to a Discordant System. I really enjoy this album. And again, I was very young. I was probably around 13, I want to say, when I first heard this album. And I, again, really hadn't heard anything like this. I just heard it, and I was like, holy fuck, that is heavy. Wow. And yeah, this album is, again, some people might argue that Meshuggah are kind of in the death metal realm a little bit. Personally, I would say they're not. Like, to me, they're kind of just like a weird, like, avant-garde, polyrhythmic, kind of like groove metal band in a way. I don't, it's something like that. But yeah, I love this band, and yeah, this is possibly my favorite album. I don't know, there's a couple that are like really up there for me, but yeah, Obzen, this album's always really just stood out to me as just, again, it's a very heavy album. Like, the guitar tone of this album is fucking lethal. And again, like, you have I forget the vocalist's name. Unfortunately, his name escapes me at the moment. But you know, he's just like barking his guts out the whole album. And yeah, this is definitely one of the heaviest albums I've heard. Again, earlier on, like this band is very much in the same category as Strapping Young Lad, where it's just, again, not quite death metal, really, kind of, but very, very heavy. And again, but still kind of more accessibly heavy, if that kind of makes sense. Because again, like 13-Year-Old Me heard it and was like, I like this. This is awesome. So yeah, that's kind of like the final album of the, I guess, non-death metal albums I want to discuss for this video. Yeah, Obzen, I love this album, and this is definitely one of the most important albums I heard for getting me as a younger metalhead into more extreme metal. All right, moving on now to the death metal albums. I very much kind of remember the very first death metal album I ever heard. Because I actually just, at one point, because again, after I listened to like all this stuff, after I listened to Meshuggah and Strapping Young Lad, and I slowly discovered about this thing called death metal, and I literally just Googled death metal bands, and this band was the very first band that popped up. So I went on YouTube or Spotify or whatever it was, and I listened to this album, and that is none other than Symbolic from Death. This was the very first death metal album I ever heard, and I still love it to this day. Now, granted, it's not my favorite death album anymore. That award goes to Human. For me, it's not even my favorite death metal album anymore. There's a lot of other death metal albums I like more than this. But I still love this album for how important it was for me as this was my very first exposure to death metal. And yeah, this album really, I mean, you really can't go wrong with Death. Death have nothing even close to a mediocre release, and this album is frankly just a perfect album. Really, you get the perfect production. Chuck Schuldner's vocal performance on this album is amazing. It's technical. It's like progressive. There's also great like harmonies and great melodic sections. Like, dare I say, this is like kind of a very influential album in this is like an influential album like all across the death metal spectrum, because again, it's like hugely influential like tech death and progressive death metal, but I would also say this is definitely influential to melodic death metal, because 1995 melodic death metal was still very, very much in its infancy, and I feel like a lot of like melodeath bands took heavy inspiration from this album in particular. Sound of Perseverance too, but this album in particular is really also very melodic. And yeah, I mean, amazing songs. Metallic, I still love that song. Crystal Mountain. Yeah, this album, Misanthrope, Perennial Quest, 1000 Eyes. This is just an amazing album. And yeah, again, first death metal album I ever heard. So yeah, when I heard this, I was blown away. I hadn't heard anything like this. Well, I kind of did at this point, but again, this was the first proper, true death metal album I ever heard. And I was like, okay, this thing called death metal, I love it. I'm going to be a fan of it for the rest of my life. Not long after I discovered Death, I discovered another very popular death metal band, probably the most popular death metal band like ever. Like, I mean, I feel like even people who don't like metal know who these guys are. They at least know them by name. Obviously, I'm talking about Cannibal Corpse, specifically their album Tomb of the Mutilated. Yeah, this might have been my first Cannibal Corpse album. I feel like this was my first Cannibal Corpse album. I'm really a little bit hazy on that, because this whole kind of time period for me is just kind of a blur, just because during that time period of my life there was just a lot of shit going on, and music really wasn't an overly huge focus on my life. But yeah, Cannibal Corpse, obviously, again, they're pretty much the death metal band, right? They are the biggest death metal band that ever was. They are like the most popular death metal band in the world. Again, even people who aren't into death metal know at least them by name, or at least have seen maybe, you know, the Ace Ventura movie and seen them in it, right? Like, again, they were in like Ace Ventura, a hugely successful movie. This band is awesome and everywhere. But personally with this album, because again, I feel like this was my first, like, I know I said Symbolic was my first proper death metal album, but in terms of like death metal, I feel like this was my first introduction, because again, With Symbolic, it's a death metal album, without a doubt. It's very heavy, it's very much death metal, but again, it's very melodic in some parts, it's very kind of technical, there's a lot of more progressive song structures and songwriting. This is just like pure, disgusting, primal death metal, but it is also still, you know, hook-laden and catchy death metal. Like, the album cover is gory and disgusting. When I first heard this album, I was completely drawn in just by the artwork and by like the sample at the beginning of Addicted to Vaginal Skin. My mom heard that, because I listened to this album to fall asleep one time, and my mom was like walking by my room, and she heard that fucking sample at the beginning of Addicted to Vaginal Skin, and she was like, "What the actual fuck are you listening to?" Yeah, she was really, really mad at me. My sister too, but yeah. So that, you know, really kind of cemented it in my mind a little bit, like, oh, this is something different. Like most music doesn't make people react like this. This is something different. I want to keep listening to this, and I have. And yeah, I mean, Tomb of the Mutilated, this album really doesn't need an introduction. I know I've been rambling on and on about it, but again, it's a pure death metal classic. Obviously, Hammer Smash Face is like a death metal anthem, one of the probably top 5 greatest death metal songs of all time. And then dude, like, I mean, of course, Addicted to Vaginal Skin is awesome. Necropedophile is probably my favorite track on here, honestly. Beyond the Cemetery, Cryptic Stench. I love this album. And again, not my favorite Cannibal Corpse album. That award goes to The Wretched Spawn. Not even my favorite of the Barnes era, Chris Barnes Cannibal Corpse albums. But overall, man, I do dig the shit out of this album. Yeah, I love it. Tomb of the Mutilated. It is a huge album for me to get into death metal, and one of the albums that really cemented death metal as a genre that I really, really like. The next album I'm going to discuss on this list is a band I didn't get into with this album. Like, this is a band that kind of has an interesting evolution over the years. Like, they started off very much as a death metal band, but they definitely changed the course of their sound as the years went along. That band is Paradise Lost, and for this video, I'm going to be talking about their debut album, Lost Paradise, which came out back in 1990. As I said, this was not the album that got me into Paradise Lost. I got into Paradise Lost with Draconian Times, which I fucking love. That album, that's still probably my favorite album by this band. That album is an absolute masterpiece, but it's definitely not a death metal album. That's just kind of like a more gothic doom metal album. But obviously, Paradise Lost, they are kind of considered one of the Peaceville 3 of Death Doom. And yeah, Paradise Lost kind of... they start off much heavier than they kind of would evolve, and this debut, Lost Paradise, this is just like a flat-out, you know, death metal album. Like, it's definitely got some doomy parts, but this is, for the most part, just, like, kind of just straight-up death metal. Yeah, and when I heard this album, like, going back and listening to this album, I was kind of blown away. I was kind of shocked. I was like, okay, this is something a little bit different, because, again, I got into Paradise Lost with Draconian Times, so I went and listened to this debut expecting it to sound like Draconian Times, but no, it sounds very different. Like, the production is way more raw. Nick is not doing his, like, gothic cleans. He's just sticking with his very low roaring death growls, which I've really grown to like his death growls over the years. And yeah, again, super raw, super just death metal-y, and for the most part, it is kind of just like more death metal-y. Again, it has very doomy elements, but I think this is just kind of more of a flat-out death metal album. In terms of Paradise Lost, this isn't, like, a particular favorite of mine, necessarily. Like, I prefer their more kind of, like, gothic stuff, or I even prefer, like, the gothic, which came out right after Lost Paradise, or even prefer, like, hell, their new stuff is really good, too. I just love this band in general, but, yeah, this isn't, like, necessarily a favorite of mine when it comes to Paradise Lost as a band. But, again, as someone who was just dipping their toe into death metal, hearing this album kind of really, I was like, okay, so this is definitely interesting. Like, I was kind of like, huh, I wonder how many other bands out there, like, kind of started off much heavier and just kind of changed their sound like this. Because, again, going into it, I didn't expect it to sound like it did. But, yeah, overall, I do dig this album. And this was, again, pretty instrumental album for getting me into death metal. So, yeah, Paradise Lost, Lost Paradise, not to be confused with their self-titled album, Paradise Lost. I don't really know why they did that, but they did. But yeah, this album is pretty kick-ass, and again, pretty important album for getting me into death metal. So the next album I'm going to discuss is an album I have talked about an awful lot on this channel, and I'm pretty sure last time I brought up this album was in my collection update, and I think I said I didn't want to talk about this album again for like a fairly long time, but guess what I'm talking about now, because frankly, this video would be impossible to make without this album. This is the most important album for me on this list. This is the most important album. And of course, you all probably know which album I'm talking about. It is Last One on Earth from Acephyx. This is my favorite death metal album of all time. This was the album that cemented my love of death metal. So of course, I got into Death, and I got into Cannibal Corpse, and I got into some of the other like bigger old school death metal bands. I got into Carcass and Morbid Angel, Pulver, Deicide, bands like that, you know, fairly big bands. And Acephyx, while they're not like super obscure or underground by any means, they are definitely kind of like one of the lesser known, like they're not up there with like the big giants in terms of like notoriety, but I mean, they're still relatively well known, but they're not like up there near the tippity top like with Cannibal Corpse and Deicide in my opinion. But this was the first like kind of more obscure death metal album I ever heard, and I absolutely have fallen in love with this album. Like, it was honestly kind of love at first sound with this album. The first song I heard was, you know, MS Bismarck, and I was just like, holy fuck, this is heavy. Like, dude, the guitar tone of this album is amazing, and Martin Van Druenen's vocals, my favorite death metal vocalist of all time. That dude is fucking insane. Like, I just absolutely love Martin Van Druenen's vocals, and again, I could go on and on and on and on and on about how much I absolutely just adore this album. This is like desert island shit. Like if I had to delete every other death metal album from existence, I mean, I wouldn't want to, but it would suck. But someone said to me like, hey, you have to save, you can only listen to one death metal album for the rest of your life or else the world explodes. Which one is it? It's this one. It's got to be this one. I love this album. Acephyx Last One on Earth is my favorite death metal album. I would say my favorite like extreme metal album of all time. Yeah, this is the album that cemented my love of death metal, and I got into it, you know, again, fairly early on. It's an album that's always been with me throughout these years, so Acephyx Last One on Earth, again, I've talked about it a lot, but this video would be impossible to make without it, so yeah, Last One on Earth, guys, it's my favorite death metal album. It had to be on here. So we're coming up on my last two albums here, and these are kind of more for specific, like, subgenres of death metal, rather than death metal as a whole. So yeah, the first subgenre I want to get into is one of my personal favorite subgenres, brutal death metal. Now, admittedly, I wasn't necessarily like the most avid brutal death metal fan before I started this channel, but ever since starting this channel, I've gotten a lot more into it, and I love pretty much most brutal death metal bands that I could come across. But this was the album that really got the ball rolling for me in terms of brutal death metal. Now, I know a lot of people would maybe say, oh, but Cannibal Corpse is brutal death metal. To me, no, I feel like they have brutal elements, but to me, they're just kind of like a more of like a straight up just old school death metal band, I would say. To me, they have too much like just old school death metal moments to be a brutal death metal band, but that's just my opinion. But the album for me that I feel like that opened the floodgates for me in terms of brutal death metal, the album that introduced me to brutal death metal, it is none other than None So Vile from Cryptopsy. This album kind of scared me a little bit, like the first time I heard it, because it just like I heard it and I was like, what the actual fuck is going on? This guy sounds like a feral zombie who's gonna come and eat me. And like listening to all, you know, just these nutty riffs and this fucking flow, just beating the shit out of his drums, I was like, what the hell's going on? None of this makes any sense. I'm kind of scared of this. But very quickly I warmed up to it, and I mean, None So Vile, this is a masterpiece. Again, this is an album that needs no introduction in terms of death metal. This is like one of the death metal albums, frankly, like especially one of the brutal death metal albums. Like, this is one of the most iconic albums in that whole subgenre. You know, songs like Crown of Horns, Slit Your Guts, Graves of the Fathers, Phobophile, Dead and Dripping. I absolutely love this album, and again, this was the album that kickstarted my love of brutal death metal. This is still really, really up there in terms of my favorite brutal death metal albums. Like, there's a couple that are, maybe might beat it out, but this is still very, very near the top in terms of my favorite brutal death metal albums. And yeah, I absolutely love this album. Cryptopsy, None So Vile, the album that got me into brutal death metal. So yeah, this album will always be very special to me. Alright, and the final album we're going to discuss for this video is, again, this album is like kind of for a specific subgenre of death metal rather than kind of death metal as a whole. This wasn't the first album I heard from this genre, unlike, say, None So Vile, but this was definitely an album that really stood out to me, and album that really kind of made me a big fan of this genre. And that the genre is melodic death metal, the band is In Flames, and the album is The Jester Race. Now, In Flames have a very unfortunate evolution. They have just gotten... Like, I love their early material. I love this album, which we'll get to, but I also love, Whoracle, Colony, and Clayman. All three of those albums are amazing. But then, after Clayman, they've just gotten progressively worse and worse and worse and worse with every single release. And it's just so sad to see how far this band has fallen, because they were a staple in melodic death metal at this point. But anyways, enough of pining for yesteryear. Let's just talk about this album. So again, this whole kind of time period for me is a little bit hazy, admittedly, but I don't think this was the first melodic death metal album I heard, because I did hear Carcass and At the Gates before this album, I want to say. But this was the album that really kind of got me into melodic death metal, I'd say, because, again, I understand why a lot of death metal fans might not like melodic death metal, but because, it is kind of, more melodic and inherently more accessible than just normal death metal. But I got into... I listened to this album and I was just really drawn into, again, the great, obviously the melody, the great folky melodies all over this album, the amazing harmonies. It's like, dude, because I got into, classic heavy metal before anything, so I was already a giant fan of, Iron Maiden, and I was like, dude, this sounds like, like Iron Maiden mixed with, like Morbid Angel. I love this. How can people do this? And yeah, I got into this album big time, and yeah, I absolutely love this album. I feel like this might be my favorite. I don't know, between this and Clayman, it's really hard, but yeah, this was the album that kind of really, I think, got me into melodic death metal. I got into Dark Tranquillity, and Amon Amarth, and a couple others after this album. And mainly when it comes to... Admittedly, when it comes to melodic death metal, I do kind of prefer the heavier side of melodic death metal, like Intestine Ballism, Vehemence, Grenadier, stuff like that. But I do still love the old school Gothenburg Melodeath, and this is an absolute staple in that. One of the whole, again, albums that got the ball rolling for that entire scene. So yeah, In Flames, Jester Race, one of the maybe the album that got me into melodic death metal. I love this album. And, well, that concludes this video about the 10 albums that got me into death metal. These obviously weren't all the albums that got me into death metal. This is just kind of a small handful of albums I wanted to discuss. I'm going to quickly wrap up this video here because this video is getting quite long, so I'll quickly end it here. If you made it to the end of this video, you are awesome and I appreciate you. Do consider leaving a like if you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment down below. Tell me, do you agree with my thoughts on these albums? Do you disagree? What are the albums that got you into death metal? Let me know down in the comments. And yeah, if you're not subscribed, do consider subscribing because I do have a lot more content coming your way. Well, that about does it. I am just another heavy metal maniac. I'll see you all sometime in the future. In the meantime, all of you take care and have a great day. So long.